So welcome back to another video here in Pennsylvania once again. It's time for another campfire chat. I did one of these a couple months ago. Talked about dealing with trauma and situations like that. And this one, as you can tell, the title of the video is dealing with a different topic concerning emergency preparedness. And there are no lack of videos on YouTube and websites out there that talk about this topic. Some of them go pretty extreme, talking about the zombies coming, or a worldwide apocalypse of some sort. But it doesn't have to be that extreme. Because when you listen to some folks talk on that subject, it seems like they're trying to scare you into being prepared. I'm not really sure that's the way it should be. I feel like my message is be prepared, not scared. I feel like when you prepare out of scaredness, you kind of do things the wrong way. You kind of prepare out of fear and panic. Like you shouldn't. The time to realize that you need to be prepared for emergencies and other situations is not when the emergencies happen or when the natural disaster occurs. You should be prepared before then. And part of me has always kind of been into this subject. I grew up on a little farm, and even into adulthood I lived there. I had a wood stove in my house that I could rely on for heat. So if there's a big snowstorm came in and the electricity went out, it was okay because I still had heat. I could still warm up food on the wood stove. I was kind of prepared for things like that. Of course, I had all kinds of chickens and animals. The chickens laid eggs. I could eat the eggs, eat the chickens. I had a garden. I wasn't completely self-sufficient, but I was kind of into that stuff. And it was comforting when I knew, the weather's talking about huge blizzards coming. There's probably going to be power outages and all kinds of stuff like that. I'd look on my front porch, see that stack of firewood, and I knew that I was going to be okay. Even if the power did go out for a couple of days, I was going to be all right. And it was so preparedness, being prepared can be comforting as well. Typically most of us don't really think about emergency situations until they happen. Typically, we're at home, maybe you're cooking, maybe you're watching TV, maybe you're on the computer watching some show on Netflix or doing some work, and then boom, all of a sudden the power goes out, and you're like, oh no. So maybe you go around, maybe it's in the evening too, in the winter when it's cold, so you're worried about those things, there's no lights. What are you going to eat for supper that night? Because you can't really cook anything, traditionally. You go looking for a flashlight, you don't really remember where the flashlight is, and even when you find the flashlight, the batteries are dead, and you think, oh great. Or I know a lot of people use their phones these days, but maybe you pick your phone up to turn the flashlight and your phone on, and your phone chimes at you telling you that you only have 10% battery life left. Then all of a sudden you start realizing, we're, as an individual, as a family, we're not really prepared for situations like this. So you start running through your mind all the different things that you probably should do, all the different things you should probably have around your house. Extra batteries, different ways of making food without electricity, all that kind of stuff you start thinking about. But then what happens? Well, what happens next, in most cases, is that just a few hours later, the power comes back on, and all that thinking you were doing about being better prepared for these situations kind of goes to the wayside, because all of a sudden life just goes back to normal. You go back to cooking or being on the computer and different things, and you kind of forget about those things that you realize maybe you should do. And one thing that impacted my thinking on this too was, I think it was back in 2005, I think it was Hurricane Katrina. Not sure if I have my dates correct there, but that was the one that hit New Orleans. I remember just watching the news, they said it was coming, and then when it finally hit, just watching all the people, that was when all these people were kind of stranded on the rooftops and stuff, because parts of New Orleans are underwater, or below sea level to begin with, and they just got flooded. People had busted holes in their roof and were waiting on rooftops to be rescued and stuff, and there's just so many people that were not ready for it. They hadn't done nothing to prepare for that hurricane. Now I gotta be careful because everybody's situation is different. I think there was one nursing home that the staff just left the people there, things like that. And other people, sometimes people in big cities like that don't have their own transportation. They rely on public transportation. I think the mayor of New Orleans got pretty big trouble for that, because they could have used public buses and stuff to get people out. It was a mess. I just remember. And they were trying to get everybody to go to the Superdome, I think that's what it was called, that big arena. And that was a disaster too, because the bathrooms weren't working, but people kept using the bathroom, thousands and thousands of people. There's supposed to be all this food and water there, and it wasn't, if I remember correctly. All this water that was supposed to get there They didn't know where it was. I think months later they found it in some storage place somewhere, but it was a mess. But sadly enough, there was one person they interviewed that was prepared, and the way they interviewed him kind of bothered me. I remember he was in the French Quarter. I think it's one place they call it, New Orleans there. And he was kind of just sitting in the second floor window. I think the flooding had stopped. And they were questioning him, why didn't you go to the Superdome where everybody else went? They were like treating him like he was crazy. He's like, well, I was shelter. You know, he was up on the second floor. The building was fine. He had food. He had water up there. He had everything he needed because he was prepared for what happened. But they were like almost making him out to be some kind of like an idiot because he didn't, flee to the Superdome like everybody else did. Well, why would he do that? That place was overcrowded, disgusting. The food and water that was supposed to be there wasn't. He was the one that was doing things right. But the media, they were kind of ridiculing him, and that kind of struck me a little bit. Like we need to be more like him in those emergency situations to be prepared, rather than so many other people who weren't, and were relying on a higher power to help them, and that higher power in the end didn't really offer much help to begin with. Back to that whole evening without power scenario again. We've all had that happen, but we're all kind of adjusted to the idea that within a couple hours or the next morning the power will come back on again and everything will go back to normal. But what if it doesn't come back on for a while? What if it doesn't come back on for like a week because a hurricane came through or just other huge tropical storm? I think it was back in 2012 there was Hurricane Sandy. Well, I think by the time it hit New York it wasn't a hurricane anymore, but man, that storm just caused so much damage. People were without power for weeks. What are you going to do then? Are you prepared for something like that? And for me, personally, things changed. When I had to move off the farm, I was in a situation where I didn't feel as secure about things as I had when I lived there. Now all of a sudden, my heat was dependent upon electricity and not a wood stove. I couldn't just heat up my food on a wood stove if the power was out either. Things like that. It was all different. So I kind of had to adjust to that. Because to be honest, most of us, like especially imagine, power goes out, it's 10 degrees outside, 20-mile-an-hour winds, and most of us, our heat is in some way dependent upon electricity. Maybe not directly from it, but to run even like an oil furnace and stuff, you need electricity. So one of the things I did is I got a kerosene heater. I remember growing up, we had them in the house growing up when I was a kid, but I remember they smelled like kerosene back then, but the new ones don't smell that bad. I've used it a couple times when power went out in the house, and that thing works great. You don't need electricity for it. That's one thing to consider too. Do you have something to stay warm when the power goes out like that during the wintertime? What are you going to do about food and cooking and water, clean, fresh water? Because if the power goes out, you also don't have water in your house or water pressure. That's one of the things that always gets you when the power goes out, even just for a couple hours. And I think, well, maybe I'll just, get some water. And then you go to turn the faucet on, you realize, yeah, there's no water pressure because the power is off. So you can't even get clean water necessarily. So, something as simple as having, a couple of gallons. You can go to the store and get those gallon jugs of water. Just keep a couple of those somewhere in your house. Those are super cheap. Or you can get the bottled water. It's a super easy way to have some clean, fresh water if you are going to do some cooking, like with cooking, like with me, I have all that camp gear, so I have all those little propane stoves and things, so I could still cook a meal up if I wanted to, but not everybody has that kind of gear in their home, like a little propane stoves and stuff. But I would still need water for boiling things. So, but I do have a couple of those, 1-gallon jugs of water at home down the basement, in case there's a need for them. And then, like I said, what are you gonna do about food then? You gotta make sure, it's good to have food available that's easy to prepare, that you don't necessarily need an oven for or a microwave for. Things that just you can prepare quickly, like over like a little camp stove, or even like that kerosene heater I got. It's kind of really big. It kind of has a wire cage around it. It gets really hot. I could set like a skillet or a pan up on top of that. I could probably fry or cook some stuff on top of that maybe too. But yeah, it helps to have. I really think like camp food would be a good thing to have available, or things that don't perish. Like if the power's out for a long time, everything in your fridge is going to spoil. So you want to have things in storage that don't spoil, like canned food or dried foods that will last indefinitely in a more of an emergency situation. Things that you can store indefinitely and they're ready there for you to use. Something to keep in mind as well. And on that same note, if you're going to have food like that stored in your house, food that you're going to potentially use during an emergency situation, make sure you know how to use it or cook with it. I've kind of an embarrassing story to say with that, but one of the things I have stored up are dried beans. You can buy those bags of dried beans at most grocery stores. They're super cheap, and they're actually not that difficult to make if you know what you're doing. I think years ago, I decided, hey, maybe I should try making some of these to see what they're like and see how easy it is. So I thought like cooking up dried beans was like cooking up rice or pasta. I just got some boiling water going, tossed a bunch of beans in there. I thought, maybe half an hour they'll be ready to eat. No, I had them in for several hours more, and nothing was happening. So yeah, there's a certain way to cook dried beans, and I had to learn that the hard way. They're still a good food to keep around for situations like that. Like you just need to know how to cook them. They're super easy. It's just time consuming. You gotta let them soak overnight, like in a bowl of water. And then in the next morning, you change out the water and you put the beans in like what we call around here a crock pot, or some people call it a slow cooker. And you put them in there, and then throughout the day, they'll soften up even more. So it takes a long time for them to cook up, but it is kind of super easy. You don't really have to do much with it. Because if the power goes out, you can't use a slow cooker, but if you had a situation where you had like a little campfire out, back behind your house or something, you could slow cook them that way too. So they are still something to keep around in an emergency food situation. They can be used. But there's all kinds of foods that you can have around for situations like that, but just make sure you know how to use it. Make sure you also like that food. Don't go and buy a bunch of like emergency rations and then realize, oh, I don't really like this stuff. So it's good to have that kind of stuff on hand. And some other things to consider having around would be extra cash. Depending on what the situation is, you might not be able to use, online credit cards or things like that, so it's good to have some cash around. Also, have maybe some, the old school things like candles and matches and things like that. Flashlights, batteries, extra batteries around. But even like in more modern sense, to have like because we are reliant like on our phones and things like that, have like a power bank or a power station. You can have a generator too. I'll talk about that in a moment. But like for camping, I have that little power station I bring along, or even smaller power banks that you can charge up your phone and other items that need a charge. You just keep those charged, and they can last for quite a while. In certain emergency situations, you can have a limited amount of electricity. Because obviously, when the power goes out, I can't use my computer anymore, my laptop. But just because the power's out doesn't necessarily mean that the cable or that the signal is out on the cable line where my internet comes through. So if I plug my Jackery, my power station, if I plug the what do you call it, the cable modem, I guess that's what they still call it, into the Jackery, I could still potentially have a signal and still use my computer, because I could plug my computer into the Jackery, the power station as well, because it will only last so long. But that's one thing you can do. Even some smaller appliances, you could plug into those things and have a little bit of electricity. So it's something to keep in mind to have around. And then in situations like natural disasters, like if you're in a hurricane-prone area, I think it's good to have a plan. Well, I don't think it's good. I think it's necessary to have a plan of what you're going to do before those events even happen. Have a place, like if there are going to be evacuations and stuff, have a place that you're all going to meet up at. Maybe it's grandma's house who lives, 100 miles inland or something from areas, and everybody knows that that's the evacuation destination. So if the family gets split up or things like that, everybody still knows where to go or where to meet up at. It would help too to have like a bin of supplies ready, like if you do have to evacuate, just quickly, that you can just grab that bin, toss it in the car, grab your kids, toss them in the car too, and just take off. You don't have to run around the house in a panic thinking of what should I take along, what should I take along. You already have everything in that bin. Like I said, maybe some food, water for the trip, extra clothes, extra cash, things that you'll need if you're going to be away from home for a couple days or more, at least some emergency stuff. So when the orders for the evacuation come, or better yet, leave before the orders for the evacuation come, you can, like I said, just grab, you're prepared, not scared. Just grab that bin of stuff and go where you need to go. Something to keep in mind. I think would be helpful for a lot of people. Like I said, if you're going to evacuate, maybe evacuate before everybody else does. I feel like when you wait till everybody else is doing it, then everybody's just stuck in those huge, long traffic jams. You're not really getting away anyway. So maybe if you're the type of person that's going to evacuate, then maybe, do it before everybody else does. Get a head start. And if you're going to be that person that doesn't evacuate, kind of like that one guy I talked about earlier in the video who, during Hurricane Katrina, just make sure that you are prepared for, you know, a decent amount of time without any power or, you know, things like that. So make sure you have everything you need, plenty of food and water, you know, medical stuff, you know, things that you'll need in a long-term emergency situation. You know, don't stay and be unprepared so that you end up having to be rescued. It just creates trouble for yourself and everybody else. You know, if you're gonna risk staying in situations like that, then make sure you are definitely prepared. And no, I'm not advising that you do stay behind during a hurricane when everybody else is evacuating. I'm just saying that that's not my advice. I'm saying if you do so, just make sure you are prepared. And as far as other stuff that you would potentially need during an emergency situation, like a natural disaster, you know, blizzard, hurricane, or a power outage or something else, you know, it's going to be different for everybody. So maybe just consider, you know, what do you use on a daily basis? You know, what are you dependent upon on a daily basis? And maybe make a list of that kind of stuff, and maybe have extras of that around, and, you know, things like that. What do you know, we're all different, like I said. You know, some of us have families, some of us don't. Some of you have special needs like medications and other medicine that you need to have around. Maybe have extras of that. You know, it all varies from person to person. So just like I said, take stock of what do you use on a daily basis. You know, what do you need on a daily basis, and just consider how long would that last in an emergency situation. One of the things I do is I talk about this topic with my students in some of my classes, mostly in my class on environmental science. It does fit in. I find a way to make it fit in. But one of the projects I have them do for homework is to go home for one of the homework assignments and to take inventory of all the food that's in their house, you know, roughly speaking. They don't have to record every single macaroni, but make a list of all the food that's in your house, and then based on how many people in your house and stuff, how long would that food supply last? You know, like say there was a blizzard scenario where, you know, like 10 feet of snow fell, and, you know, I kind of make it a harsh situation, you know, and you couldn't get out of the house, really. You couldn't get to the grocery store, couldn't get help. Maybe you could get to your neighbor's house and stuff like that, but how much food do you have, and how long would it last? You know, it's something to consider. You know, some of the students, it's kind of an eye-opener just to how severe things can be sometimes. Like, we don't really think about getting 10 feet of snow. Like, where I live here in Pennsylvania, probably not, but we have had some blizzards in the past years, though. But it's something to consider. Something makes them think about how prepared they are for situations like that. And as I'm making this video, I realize that I'm speaking to myself as well, because there's still some things that I should do to be better prepared as well. Just a reminder too that the time to prepare is not when everybody else is preparing either. You know, don't wait till a day before the hurricane arrives to go out and buy the supplies you need, because that's what everybody else is doing. Like I mentioned a generator earlier, you can get those gas generators that, you know, run on the gas, and they produce electricity. But a lot of times people realize they need one right before a disaster is going to hit. But the problem is everybody else realizes that too, and everybody else is at Lowe's and Home Depot and Walmart buying all the power, buying all those generators, and they're going to be sold out. So get one before the panic hits. And also, just a note on generators too. Every year people make this mistake. You know, generators, the gas ones, they produce fumes. You know, there's carbon monoxide in those fumes. You don't run the generator inside your house. It can poison you and kill you or your whole family. Always keep the generator outside of the house. And something else to consider too, if you are going to potentially be in a situation where you need to evacuate, make sure you have a full tank of gas before those evacuation orders come out. Because if you wait till the order to evacuate comes out, everybody else is going to be realizing that they need to fill their gas tank as well, and then there's going to be huge long lines at the gas stations, and they'll probably run out of gas anyway. So, you know, in a situation where like a hurricane's coming, make sure, you know, several days before that you keep that gas tank full, so that you're, like I said, so that you're ready to go. And as you're watching this video, if you have your own ideas or your own suggestions for what the folks watching this video, or even me myself, what we all could do to be better prepared in an emergency situation, go ahead and comment below and let us know what you think another good idea might be. As I said earlier, what you should do personally to be ready, prepared, differs from person to person and the situation to situation. So there's an endless number of scenarios out there for disaster situations. And another thing I'd like to bring up too, though, is if we're talking about like major disasters, it gets a lot more difficult. if you're talking about, a worldwide economic collapse or other horrible things like some super disease comes out, that has a, 50% mortality rate, things are going to be a lot different. And yeah, it's much more difficult to be prepared for things like that. It's not as easy as just keeping some extra batteries around or some extra water, because you might be uprooted from where you live and you might end up being a refugee or things like that, and that just changes everything. It's not as easy. So that's a whole nother topic. That's a whole nother discussion. What to do in a situation like that, where like a major emergency comes along or disaster. That just changes everything. So, the reality is too, some people might think you're nuts. They come over to your house and see go in your basement, see all this bottled, jugs of water and canned food, and might think, oh, you're one of those people. I think there's a name for people that prepare. They call them preppers sometimes. P-R-P-P-E-R, a prepper. And the reality is you may never end up using all that stuff. You might, through your lifetime, you may never experience a real disaster emergency situation, but it is still better to be prepared than, caught with your pants down, as the phrase goes. But, I want to bring that up. There's a balance to being prepared too. Some people do go, you don't need to go nuts about it. You don't need to have 10 years worth of 10-year supply of food in your basement. I'm not saying you're wrong if you do. There are people that do that kind of stuff. That deals more with that whole much more major, like serious, like worldwide disaster type situation. But I know a story. There's one guy did have like 5 years of food in his house, in his basement, but then his basement flooded and just destroyed all his supplies. So that's something to keep in mind too. You can be super prepared for the end of the world, and just like that, a flood just wipes out all your preparations. And then there's people that spend like $10,000 to put a nuclear-proof bunker in their backyard, or some place up in the mountains. Once again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but you don't need to go super nuts about just being prepared. Like what I'm talking about in this video is mostly focusing on more manageable emergencies, things that you can indeed prepare for. Like I said, there's major ones, like if you're preparing, how do you prepare for the zombie apocalypse or a nuclear world war, things like that. That just changes everything. Once again, a lot harder to indeed prepare for that, because like I said, everything you have prepared is probably going to get destroyed anyway, or you might end up being a refugee and have to leave it all behind. So anyway, just kind of rambling there a little bit with my thoughts. And it's not just about keeping prepared or emergency stuff in your house, but how about in your vehicle as well? Because people do get stranded during snowstorms and things like that. On my way, just even on my way back to years ago when I was going to college, I was driving south, going through North Carolina, down Interstate 77, I think it is, coming out of the mountains there, and we were stuck for quite a while. I think two tractor trailers were trying to pass each other, and they got stuck, and what should have been a 10-hour trip turned into 15 hours, and I didn't run out of gas or anything, so I could keep the heat going in the car. But if you're out in a situation like that and you do run out of gas, how are you gonna stay warm? Maybe do you have a warm blanket in the car? Do you have some water, some snacks, some things that keep you going, or a winter coat? So it's good to keep things in your car as well that you could use in a situation where you might need them. And once again, you can think of all those different things that you might need in a situation like that. Make a list in your mind and just keep those things in the car somewhere. Well, my fire is almost out, so we'll go ahead and work on bring this video to an end. As I tell my students, we are spoiled as a people, especially in this country. We get to be very complacent about our situation. We're so used to, we don't really think, we don't worry about, if we go to turn the faucet on, where there's going to be water. If we turn the light switch on, where there's going to be electricity. We just assume that it's going to be there. We're very spoiled, and I just feel like we don't really think a whole lot about a life without the things we need. So it's very easy for us to not think about being prepared or for emergency situations like that. And when those, like I said, when the electricity goes out, a lot of us are like, all of a sudden don't know what to do. We walk around the house not knowing what to do, because everything we do usually on a daily basis involves electricity, to be honest, and things like that. We're so used to just having what we need. So like I said, we don't think about it a whole lot. And once again, it also, being prepared, it all depends on you. your situation, or even where you live. Some of you live way out in the country versus living in the city, and it can be a very different situation as to what you'll need and best way to be prepared. It all depends on your situation. So just keep that in mind too. What works for one person may not necessarily work for another. But like I said, if you have different ideas, once again, beyond what I talked about, I know some people I said, they go way off into, having 10 years of supply of oatmeal in their basement. Some people will tell you to turn all your cash into gold and silver and things like that. Not gonna say all that stuff's right or wrong, but you can do what you want. But like I say, if you have your own ideas, you can put some comments down below. But I think that'll be it. I think I'm just kind of rambling at this point. As always, folks, thanks for coming along, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one. Maybe another campfire chat sometime.